Hi, welcome to Candid Chats on Cancer. I'm Mary Robinson.
And I'm Jamie Moore. Mary, I hear we have a most wonderful guest with a 2-to-1 package. She's a social worker and she's a mental health worker.
Yes, I'm so excited that Stephanie Stava is here with us today, and she has her own private practice at the Good
Life Therapy.
Okay, Good Life Therapy.
Kind of like our state slogan, the good life.
Oh yeah, and we all want a good life.
I know,
right?
right?
Thank you for joining us.
Where's your practice located?
Off 114th and Center.
Okay.
Yeah, kind of catty corner from Rockbrook.
So,
And what got you interested in working with cancer patients?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people, it's kind of a personal story. And so when I had a couple of family members when I was young pass from cancer, but I think really what started me with this was that in elementary school I had a friend pass from cancer when we were in 5th grade.
Yeah.
And so that started, jump-started my desire to want to help and work with people. So aside from that, when I was in high school, I did some volunteer work with the pediatric oncology unit at Children's Hospital. So that was always very fun and uplifting and rewarding, even though it was really hard and difficult at times.
Yeah.
And I just knew from a young age, probably when I was in high school, that I knew that I wanted to be a therapist, and decided, let's follow this and see where it goes.
Exactly. And now have you had your own private practice for a long time?
It'll be 2 years in May.
Great.
For you.
Yeah. So I was in Denver for 9 years. Born and raised here in Omaha. Went to Denver for 9 years. Moved back to Omaha about 3 years ago and started private practice almost 2. So bit of a
Yay.
whirlwind.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yes. And I love the little kids. I'm sure you enjoyed the Children's Hospital when you were there.
Yes, absolutely.
But that's got to be quite an experience for a high school girl to be working with kids with cancer.
Yeah, it was, looking back on it, I didn't think anything of it at the time, but looking back on it, I'm like, that really is a big deal, a big position to be part of. But it was really fun. The groups were always really fun, and a lot of times I ended up working with the siblings of the kids who were diagnosed with cancer. So it was you never really knew what we were going to do, but we always had activities and fun things. And
Yeah, because if I
nice.
remember correctly, didn't you say that cancer is a trauma for not only the person, but the whole family?
Absolutely.
Is that correct?
Yeah, so my practice, I've predominantly focused on working with people who've experienced trauma. And for me, trauma is a really broad word. And so it incorporates things like medical diagnoses or medical traumas. And so not only are the people who've been diagnosed with cancer people who are going through something like trauma or prolonged stress, but so are the family members and even loved ones, even if they're not family, like close friends or things like that. So I would incorporate all of them.
Sometimes our caregivers are going through more trauma than we are.
Absolutely.
You have that right.
Sometimes we're just so sick we don't realize what we're going through or what we're putting our caregivers through. So what's something we can do to work with that, and help the caregivers, be able to cope with us being sick and the trauma that they have to go through?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think so often when I think about the family members that I've worked with whose spouses or parents have been diagnosed with cancer, there is a ton of stress put on those people. And not that they wouldn't want to help, right? They want to help, they want to be there, they want to do what they can. But sometimes even just acknowledging that, like, this is hard, right? Like, this is hard, and it's not just hard for me, but it's hard for all of us.
Right.
Even just acknowledging that, I think, can be really helpful, kind of putting the feeling out there. So this is really sad, this is really stressful, whatever that feeling is. I'm a really big advocate of putting that out there. And figuring out ways to give people breaks, I think, is important. I think breaks for everybody, right? If there's a little bit of respite that somebody can come in and take an hour or two once a week, every other week, whatever it might be, figuring out if there's ways that people can help, if there's if cooking is a really big stressor for the family, right? Are there things that we can do as a community to come together and help people, like meal trains and things like that? Can always be a really big help as well. So trying to figure out what maybe are the most stressful things that are happening. Is it doctor's appointments? Is it cooking? Is it house cleaning? Is there something where we can have somebody come in and help clean even once a month, right? To just kind of help tidy and organize or things like that. Kind of taking some things off of people's plates so that it's not quite as overloaded.
Oh, exactly. That sounds great.
Yeah. I have an example of that 2 weeks ago. We had a good friend of ours, Stephanie and Gary. My wife had a cold and I had just had chemo that day, and they brought over, it was a broth with vegetables and some ramen noodles, and it literally made my wife cry because that was one thing she didn't have to worry about that day. That she could feel sick, and actually, God, it was so stinking good. I ate it for 2 days in a row. But what's something that you could help, let's say like my wife, who's now found out that I've been re-diagnosed with cancer again. I mean, the first time around is trauma. Hearing it the second time around, I don't know, it's probably, is it twice the trauma, or, you know, so what can you help, what would you suggest in helping people that are, you know, that are the caregiver, that are sitting there worrying about?
Yeah, worrying about that. I'm a big advocate of having people who are around to support you, right? So whether that's friends or family, someone who's close nearby, not necessarily physically, but being able to call them, right? Having a close connection and being able to talk. Obviously, anybody, if counseling or therapy would be helpful, just having some space to be able to go and talk about your own stuff without having to worry about how it's impacting others. I know we were talking a little bit earlier about the idea of mindfulness and being really, one component of mindfulness is being really in the moment and being present in the here and now. And so even if it is a really tough situation, a really tough moment, a really tough day, whatever it might be, rather than jumping ahead to the what ifs, right? Because oftentimes as human beings, our brains go to the what ifs in a really negative way. But then we also discount this other side of what ifs in the positive way. And so really being here in the here and now, and so appreciating whatever, I know we were talking about the fashion show earlier, and so appreciating the things that we have in the here and now. Acknowledging the fact, like I said earlier, I'm a big advocate for acknowledging how we're feeling in the moment. So acknowledging maybe this is a really hard day, maybe this is really tough right now. Maybe I do need a break, maybe I do need something, maybe I need a little bit of support, and what else am I maybe thankful for or grateful for in this exact moment, in this exact day, and trying to keep our vision on that, because our mind is always, for whatever reason as human beings, we tend to go down the negative road. And so really trying to catch ourselves in, when we're in that fear-based response, being able to catch ourselves and say, okay, we need to come back. We need to come back and think about right now, not about the things that A, we don't know what's gonna happen, and B, we can't control. So what can we do right now to help?
And that is part of the questions we had too, with the fear. And you kind of answered that, didn't you, really, with just trying to be in the here and now and not focus on the bad stuff, think positive.
Yeah, you know, one of the things when I think from a trauma perspective is, I'll try to be concise about this. So from a trauma perspective, if you want to think about, people like to think about like our plate, right? Our plate is full. We have this on our plate, we have this on our plate, and there's so much on our plate. And when we experience something like trauma, or when we have this prolonged stressor, that takes up a huge part of our plate, right? That wasn't there previously. And so then everything else that becomes part of our plate ends up affecting us a little bit more than it used to, if that makes sense. So our fuse tends to get a little bit shorter, if that makes any sense.
Really?
What? I know, shocker.
I know, right?
And so when that happens, oftentimes we either go to a place what we call either hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused. So I'm getting somewhere here, but hyper-aroused is really when we get to that place where maybe we're angry, or we're feeling really anxious, or we're feeling out of control. Hypo-aroused is more when we look like we're zoning out. Maybe we're getting some depression, we're frozen, we feel kind of stuck. And so it really kind of depends for me on where are we landing, right? If I'm out, if my plate is so full that I'm flowing over, how am I flowing over? Am I flowing over in a way that is more anxiety-based, or am I overflowing in a way that's more maybe that frozen kind of depressed state? Because depending on that, I'm gonna do something differently with what I end up doing with mindfulness, right? Am I going to kind of want to get up and get activated and doing something that helps my body and helps stimulate my brain? Am I going to want to do something that actually more grounds me and more helps bring me back to, okay, what's happening right now in my present? What am I noticing maybe from my 5 senses? What do I see? What do I hear? What can I smell? What are things that are happening in the here and now to help bring me back down and calm me down? So it kind of depends if I'm feeling more from an anxious perspective or a hyper-aroused perspective, or more of a depressed, frozen, which is more that hypo-aroused.
Yeah.
So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. People like, well, I kind of would go on both sides of that fence.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
I have a tendency to be hypo-aroused, and I kind of just store everything inside until I get to the point.
Yes.
And then my wife can literally come through the door one day, and hydration is a very important thing for cancer.
Sure.
And she would just set a glass of water in front of me, and that would be all she would wrote.
Mm-hmm.
And I would literally tell my wife exactly how I felt about her that day.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we find that happy medium? Because we go from hyper-aroused to hypo-aroused, and it's
And it
hard.
can be quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I feel like you take it out on the ones you love the most, because they're still going to love you.
Yep. They're the safest, right?
Oh, I don't know.
Yes.
There's some days where my wife looked at me.
Oh, Jamie, I'm sure. You're funny.
I think for me, I think about it as kind of like a soda bottle, right? If you think about having a tightened lid on the soda bottle, and you shake it, and that's a stressor, and then you shake it again, and that's a stressor, and this thing kind of irritated me or frustrated me, and that's another shake. And we aren't actually releasing any of it, and we're just letting it build up, and then one day it kind of pops off and it explodes everywhere, and that's kind of what you're talking about, right? Is that it just goes everywhere. And so for me, it's really about finding things that help us relieve that pressure little bit by little bit by little bit. And so I think that depends on the person. For me, connection is a huge piece, and so I'm always advocating for people to be in connection with others. And so whether that's family or friends or neighbors or whoever, being in connection, I know like social support groups we were going to talk about too. Support groups can be a wonderful thing. But is it something like mindfulness and meditation? Is it if you can get outside for a little bit, or can you look outside and enjoy something in nature? Reading or journaling. Gratitude journals are huge right now, writing 3 things that we're really grateful for in detail. So finding things, knitting, I'm a big knitter. I also love the Golden Girls. So for me, watching the Golden Girls and knitting is my Zen zone. So finding those things that we really enjoy and being able to do those things intermittently to help release that pressure. I'm using like a soda bottle over here. And then just talking. I think being able to really communicate in honest ways can help relieve that pressure too. And being able to come back and repair when we know that we've messed up. Like, I know I yelled at you and that was not okay. That wasn't fair of me to do, right?
Right.
All you did was put water in front of me, right? Whatever it might be.
It's all,
Being able to come back and say, I will own that and repair that, I think can also be huge.
Yeah.
That's right. And I think it's important, to bring up again that it's not good to keep things bottled up. And I know that sometimes, people tend to do that because they don't want to hurt the other person, or they don't feel comfortable talking about their feelings.
Absolutely.
And I know that, even in my family life, I'm trying to open up more as I can, just because I know it makes me feel better.
Yeah, and just because we talk about our feelings doesn't mean that we have to be completely out of control, right? Just because we talk about feeling sad or feeling hurt or feeling scared doesn't mean that we're out of control with those emotions. And I think oftentimes too, it's a really good role modeling experience, either for kids or other people, to learn that it is okay to talk about our feelings, and it's okay to have, to even have 2 feelings at once. I think about my niece who's 4.5, and one day we were talking about something had happened, and she said, well, how are you? And I said, well, I'm sad. And she said, you're sad, but you're okay. And I said, yeah, I'm sad and I'm okay, right? It's okay to have both of those things at the same time. It's okay to experience 2 things at the same time, and taking it kind of as a learning experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Okay, well, I was just going to ask you, just speaking about losing people, I know you said you've lost people in your life that had cancer or whatnot. What can you tell us about, like, some strategies or things that people can do that have lost loved ones to cancer?
Yeah. On the onset of talking about grief and loss, one of the things that I always say is that grief is like waves. And so I don't know if either of you have ever heard of this idea before that
I haven't.
sometimes it's kind of like we're in the ocean and it's high waves and they're coming really fast and really hard and boom, 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 one after the other, right? And it feels like we're drowning. And then at some point, the ocean starts to kind of give a little bit, and the tides go back, and they're not as big, and they're not as frequent.
Right.
And so I like to think of grief as kind of like that, really any feeling, but it's pertinent when it comes to grief especially, is that when it first happens, it can feel devastating, like we are drowning, like it is out of control, right? But knowing that eventually the waves will either start to subside a little bit, they won't happen so much, or they won't be so big. Something will happen in that area. And so being aware that that happens and that those tides will ebb and flow too. That even when there are days that we feel like the tide is a little bit less right now, maybe it's not coming so big or so frequently, there may be something that happens and they start coming back really big again, right? And so thinking about it kind of as waves. So that's my first thought from a mindset perspective is, okay, today's a really big wave day, or today they're medium. Today they feel a little bit smaller, right? And kind of gauging it like that, or maybe this moment feels really big. And then I think being able to do things, again, going back to, I'm a big advocate of even just telling myself, how am I feeling right now? Today is a big wave day. Today I'm feeling a lot of grief. Today I'm really sad because I miss this, X, Y, and Z reasons. And feeling it and being aware of it, and then figuring out now what can I do to try to help lessen that wave just a little bit? What is something that I can do? So is that something like meditation and mindfulness? Is that something like going and calling a friend? Is it going and playing in the backyard with the dog? What is it that I can do that is like a very small something to try to help that wave feel a little bit less intense than it currently is right now? A couple of other things that I recommend that a lot of people really appreciate is the idea of compartmentalization. And so this idea that I'm going to spend maybe, pick a certain time of day or a certain length of time, maybe 10 minutes. So while I'm showering is my time to think about this thing. It has a specific beginning and it has a specific end, so it's harder to get lost in it, right? But that is my time to spend thinking about this thing, this person, this whatever it is that is really difficult, that brings me sadness, but that I want to honor in some way. And so something that has a beginning and that has an end that's very specific, or else we can get lost pretty easily, can be a really nice way of thinking about someone, about remembering, about missing, about honoring those feelings that we have. Because at the end of the day, grief really is just a symptom of love, right? And so honoring how much we loved that person and having specific time to do that each day or each week, however that looks for individual people. Some people also really like the idea of memorializing, and so on certain days of the year, or maybe certain days of the week, we always did Sunday brunch together. So every Sunday I'm always going to make a brunch, and that's going to be my memorial kind of thing. Or on the day that this person was diagnosed or this person passed away, those are things where I'm going to do something special on those days to remember my love. So things like that.
That really works well, because survivorship, even though sometimes we do pass away, there's the people we leave behind, and it seems to be like they're almost a lost group, because once the person with cancer passes away, the support groups for that family seem to slowly dwindle also. So survivor, what would you suggest that, how could people get together on a common ground and be able to talk about what you've just talked about, going through the grieving and going through, like when I grew up, there was the stages of grieving, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And now I know that's kind of changing a little bit. So it's traumatic to have your loved one pass away.
Absolutely.
And now you're grieving. What can you do?
Yeah. I'm going to come back to support groups for that because I think that that's huge. I think support groups give us that connection that we need, and in a way that other people don't really understand what we're going through, right?
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Sometimes we need people to understand it from our perspective, and sometimes we can't. Sometimes words are so difficult to find that we can't figure out how to say it. We just need to be around others who get it, kind of a thing. I know there's an organization here in town called Grief's Journey, and they have a lot of, this is for all sorts of grief, but they have a lot of groups for adults and kids who are going through the grief process or who have lost a loved one at some point. So I love the idea of support groups for people who are going through that. And I had another idea. Oh, you were talking about the 5 stages of grief, and one of the things that we know about the 5 stages of grief too, that while I think they're all accurate, sometimes we don't go through all of them, or sometimes we go through them more than once, right? And we're like, oh, I thought I was done with this anger phase, and here it's back again, right? And so sometimes, and we skip stages, and we go from anger to depression rather than, hitting bargaining in between. And so we now know that rather than doing it in this really linear way, that we kind of go in different places at different times and might re-experience things again. And so coming back to, all right, we're back in this place right now, right? This isn't exactly the place I want to be, but let's figure out how to help this feel just a little bit better than it does right now. And I think keeping in mind too, like you said earlier, that when something initially happens, we usually have this huge outreach from the community, right? From our family, from our friends, maybe our church or whoever, another community that we're part of. We usually have this huge outreach and support, which is so amazing. And then it seems to be after maybe a couple of weeks, maybe a few weeks, we start to see it dissipate, and it's kind of like, okay, it's no longer a thing, when it really is a thing for a long time.
Right.
And so I always tell people, one thing that people always say is well, call if you need anything. Well, really, I need you to reach out to me, right? To be like, hey, how you doing? Let's go grab coffee or something. And so even just letting people know, hey, can you reach back out in 2 weeks? Hey, can you reach back out in 2 weeks? And letting them know, I really do need you to kind of make this first step for a little while before I'm comfortable making that first step myself. And being, it's kind of this, I don't want to say controversial, but it's a difficult topic to bring up, this idea of vulnerability and being able to say, I'm having a hard time right now. I'm struggling and I could really use something. And being able to call somebody and say, hey, I'm having a hard time. Would you be willing to go out and do something? We don't even need to talk necessarily. I just need to go do something with somebody and be in connection.
Just walk the mall and,
absolutely.
just window shop, just do something normal.
Right.
Because they haven't had anything normal probably in, who knows how long.
Right. Absolutely.
And I like the point too that you bring up. I mean, you even say people are, around you or whatever for a few weeks or whatnot. Well, the same thing kind of goes for when we have chemo treatments or hospitalized, and then after a while, we don't need services anymore, and all of a sudden we're like, well, now what do we do? Right. Because we don't have the doctor's appointments like we used to have and all that, which is a really good thing. It's a positive thing, but for me, it like consumed my life for quite some time, and I had to find, find other things to occupy my time, and then reach out to some of my friends that I hadn't really talked to, and it was me taking that step.
Yep. And that for a lot of people, that it's a very vulnerable step to take, and that can be really hard for a lot of people. Because
I kind of can become a hermit if I wanted to, because I was so used to being home and isolated, and then just went to my appointments and whatnot, and then so it's kind of like figuring out your new normal.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's another good point, is that I think for some people, it almost becomes kind of like an identity. Right. And so then when it is no longer an identity, what are my other identities? Who am I? What do I enjoy? What are the things I like to do, right? Like kind of re-exploring and rediscovering ourselves.
Which can be fun.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
You know, it's
Because I don't want to identify myself with cancer.
No, I mean it's like identifying yourself with the flu all the time.
Yeah.
I got the flu. Okay,
I'm healthy.
Well,
Mm-hmm.
big deal. You know. Wrapping up everything that you do,
Yeah.
what would you say is the most important thing that can really help out people that are caregivers? You know, how do they reach out for help? What would you suggest is how can they do that?
I think sometimes it's just as easy as being willing to be vulnerable. I think for so many people that is a big step, especially when I think about caregivers, because caregivers are supposed to be the strong ones, right? Like
Right.
they're not the ones going through anything, as I'm using my air quotes here, but really they're going through a ton. And so being willing to say, I do need some support right now, right? I need something. I may need a break. I may need some normalcy, right? I may need to go to the mall and just walk around. I may need to go to a comedy club. I may need to go do something that's normal and human and fun. And so finding that kind of giving yourself permission to ask for that support and to communicate that this is tough for me right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to do things that I know, or try to do things that I know will try to help alleviate that a little bit.
It's
Stephanie?
beautifully said.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you. I appreciate
Definitely.
it.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being on. That was a lot of stuff to digest
Woo!
Yeah.
there.
Yeah,
I talked
that
a
was
lot.
Amazing.
It was
Amazing.
wonderful.
I'm sure it'll help many.
Good.
I
Yeah.
do.
Good.
Thank you,
And
Stephanie.
Yes.
Again,
Thank you.
what was the name of your?
My private practice is the Good Life Therapy,
And it's on.
114th and Center.
Do you have an email address?
Or a
Or a
website?
website?
Yep. The website is thegoodlifetherapyllc.com.
You got it.
Great.
Pretty easy.
Great.
You know, we'll send people your way.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. And join us again for another Candid Chats on Cancer.
Thank you, and be well.